This is a burial site of the Mongolian royalty. Can you read it? Noinula.
Noinula.
Yes, Noinula. Noinula. It's an very unfamiliar sound, isn't it? Can you follow it? Yeah. This is a very important burial site found in northern Mongolia. It goes back to the 2nd century BC, slightly before, it started slightly before the period of the Han Emperor Wuti, slightly before that. In this burial site, you find the burials of the kings of the Xiongnu Empire. Have you heard of Xiongnu Empire? Huh?
Yeah, in Chinese we call Xiongnu.
Yes, I unfortunately cannot pronounce it like this, but you understand what I am trying to say. This Xiongnu Empire was one of the most important empires to have risen in the history of Mongolia. Now, there is evidence to show that the Xiongnos used to receive a large number of gems, jewelry, metals, silkware, lacquerware, and many other things from Central Asia, from what is now called, in fact it was called Sogdiana in Central Asia, and of course silk from China. From this site, Noinula site, all these things have been found, which again shows that before Emperor Wuti came on the scene, trade was already being carried out between China and Mongolia, between China and Central Asia. So, for this reason also, we cannot and should not argue that the Silk Road or the Eurasian trade network came into existence as a result of the efforts of Emperor Wuti. Now, what is this story about how Emperor Wuti opened this Silk Road? Does anybody know about the story? I mentioned Zhang Qian earlier. Shangqian, how do you pronounce it? Changqian, okay. So, you see, the story is that he was in 138 BC, he was sent by Emperor Wuti. I think Wuti came to power in 141 BC, and soon after that he chose Zhang Qian for this diplomatic and military fact-finding mission. After this, I will learn this pronunciation from you. Okay?
It's okay.
So, this man was chosen by the emperor for a diplomatic and fact-finding mission. Does anybody know the rest of the story of what happened? How he went, where he went, and what he did? Nobody?
Towards today's Iran and
Huh?
Iran.
Uzbekistan? How to pronounce it? Pakistan?
Has anybody, do you have a background in history or you come from other disciplines? I am just trying to understand.
Most of them are from other disciplines.
From other disciplines.
Yeah, most of them.
We've heard of the story, but we forget about the details.
Yeah,
You forget
like
about
the
that.
name of the places we can't remember it, but we know that Zhangqian is besieged and captured by.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's correct. You know parts of it. You may not know the whole story, but you still know the basic things that happened there. You see, I'll just elaborate upon it. I'll just elaborate what happened. At this time, the Han Empire had just come into existence after what I call the Qin dynasty. You probably call it Qin, isn't it? Yes, yes. So, after the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty came into existence, and there was a big rivalry. There was a big rivalry between the Hans and the Hyungnu Empire. And it went on for centuries actually. Now, Hyungnu Empire was also a very large empire, just like China, just like the Han Empire. But in terms of the number of people, it was very small. In terms of area, it was very large. But because it was sparsely populated, so they had a much smaller number of people under them. But they were a great power, and they had one big advantage vis-a-vis China. In fact, the nomads always had this big advantage vis-a-vis China. Why is it that the Great Chinese Wall was built?
Because
To protect from whom?
The nomads.
From the nomads. You know, the concern of all the Chinese dynasties for the last about 3,000 years, well, leaving aside the modern period, was to somehow keep the nomads away. Okay. So they took all kinds of measures. One of those measures was the building of what is now called the Great Wall. Now, what was the advantage that the nomads had vis-a-vis China? China had all the advantages. It had a large number of people, it had technology, it had sedentary civilization, it had advanced agriculture, etc., etc. But what was the one big advantage that the nomads had?
they are brave.
Huh?
Because they have horses, they are brave, they can move around.
Good, good, good. Leaving aside the bravery part, every people can be brave, but leaving that aside, you mentioned horse, They had this big advantage. Horse is the animal native to Central Asia, Central Asian grasslands. Okay? Horse was found in the wild there. So the Central Asian nomads had easy access to horse, and this was the best quality horse that could be found, and they were naturally very good horse riders. This has happened in the case of all the various groups of Central Asian nomads, starting with Hyungnu. Then, can you name any other Central Asian nomadic groups?
Xianbei.
Yes. Yuchis, how do you pronounce Yuchi? Yuchis were the rivals of Hyungnu.
You mean that today's Iran or Iraq?
They were like, for example, the Huns, the people who are described as Huns, and then of course later Mongols. Mongols were the most important nomadic group who changed the course of human history in so many ways. The Mongols, all these were nomadic groups, and you would see one similarity across all the nomadic groups, and that similarity was that they were very, very good horse riders. They were very good cavalrymen. They could fight very well from the back of a horse. So this was one great advantage that Hyungnu Empire had vis-a-vis China at that time. So Emperor Wuti, because there used to be numerous raids, and then the emperor, the Chinese emperors had to sometimes bribe them, sometimes do something else to keep them away, etc., etc. So Emperor Wuti, great as he was, he wanted to find a solution to this problem. So he chose this man, and he said that, okay, you go to Central Asia, the west or the western region as it was called then, and try to build an alliance with the rivals of Hyungnu. The rivals of Hyungnu were the Yuchis. Okay. Now the Yuchis had been fighting with the Hyungnu for a very long time, but they were defeated and they had moved to to the western region. Okay. Now this man Zhang Qian left, if I remember it correctly, in 138 BC on the instructions of the emperor, and he was trying to move to Central Asia, but he was captured by the Xiongnos. He was captured by them, and you know the story. For 10 years he had to live with them. He was in captivity. He got married there, and he had a son also. He lived there for 10 years, and then he was somehow able to slip out and continue his journey after a gap of 10 years. And he went along roughly this route, no, after that, from here, these places. He probably came up to somewhere here in Bactria, which is now in northeastern Afghanistan. Northeastern Afghanistan and adjoining territories. He reached as far as Bactria, and he met the Yuchi tribe. He tried to revive, or he tried to create an alliance of the Han dynasty against the Xiongnu. But they were not interested in continuing that fight anymore, because they had moved to this region, they had settled there. They said, well, we don't want to fight our old enemy now, we want to leave that thing behind, and that's it. So that mission did not succeed, but in Bactria, Shankian found a certain kind of cloth and a certain kind of bamboo being sold in the markets, in the local markets. This he has reported, which was produced in the Shu region of China. But nobody even knew that it was produced in China. People thought that it was produced in India. Why? Because it had come not along what you call as Silk Road, but from somewhere here. From the Yunnan province, it travelled like this up to here. That bamboo and cloth had travelled along this route, and it was being sold there in Bactria. So nobody knew that it was Chinese, but when Zhangqian saw it, he recognized this as Chinese. So he went back, and again he was captured, and we know then finally he reached. So he told the emperor about all this. He said that this is what the situation is, and he also told the emperor about horses, because as I said, horses were important. So he gave the report that there are a certain blood sweating horses, certain category of horses that produce blood in their sweat, and these are heavenly horses, the best horses that could be found, and therefore your majesty must have access to them if you want to fight successfully against the Xiongnos. What the emperor did was, he did two things basically. He sent, and by the way this is important, he didn't send a commercial mission, he sent a military expedition to have access to those horses. If his intention was to carry on trade with Central Asia, he would obviously send a commercial mission, but he sent a military expedition to get hold of those horses. But that expedition did not succeed. It did not succeed, and ultimately then the Hans had to buy the horses from the Central Asians. So this was the dominant form of exchange. Actually, China in the ancient period was unwilling to export silk. Generally, it was not willing to sell silk, except for very precious commodities such as horse. There was no other way generally to buy horses from the Central Asians, and China also gave some silk away as gift and as a recognition of good diplomatic relations with different peoples and countries. So this is what happened, and then on the advice of this man, the emperor also sent another expedition to the Yunnan province in order to open up that region for trade, but then that mission also failed. So my point is that great as the efforts of Wu Ti were, it is not these efforts that had opened Central Asia to trade with China and other countries. That trade had been going on for thousands of years. His efforts might have given some boost to it, That is of course quite possible that probably trade started getting sort of some mileage out of the military expedition that he had sent, but that is that, it does not go beyond that. But what happens is that when you try to understand history, you naturally need sources and documents. So, you cannot find everything, but what you find you use. So, on the basis of that you build your historical narrative. So, what has not been found in history, the evidence that has not been found in history should be treated also as important. As we say, the dog that did not bark is also important. So, because you find documents from the Han period onwards in China, so you think that it started at that time, but it did not, it was there much earlier. This is my one of my important arguments. And the other misunderstanding that arises here is, you find that references to the West in ancient China, West or Western regions, are confused with the West in the modern period. Whereas in ancient China, the West only meant Central Asia, some adjoining regions, and also sometimes India. What did ancient Chinese sources describe India as? Does anybody know?
Can you repeat your question?
Huh?
Repeat your question.
Pardon?
Repeat your question, please. Pardon?
In the ancient Chinese books and documents,
Yeah.
what was the name used for India? Does anybody know that?
天竺，天竺，
Okay, but what is it in English?
元都，
No English.
Anyway, let me tell you, leave this aside. See, China described, this was one of the terms that they used. China described itself as the central heaven. This we know.
Yeah, we know.
And in ancient China, India was often described as the western heaven. Okay. So, China was described as the central heaven and India was described as the western heaven.
So where is the eastern heaven?
No eastern heaven. Cichina did not recognize any eastern heaven.
Okay.
In fact, you may be surprised, but in history, the only other civilization which China recognized like this was that of India. As I said, that China was surrounded by the Central Asian nomads, and Chinese dynasties and Chinese writers described the nomads as barbarians, as uncivilized, because they had a very different kind of society, they had a very different kind of economy. Now, the Chinese were not the only people in the ancient world who described the nomads as barbarians. Other sedentary civilizations in India also, they were described as barbarians only, the Central Asian nomads, and similarly by the Romans also they were described as barbarians. But when we go deeper into it, we realize that the nomads played a very important role in the history of the world, and there is no reason to look upon them as uncivilized, barbarian, etc., etc. This is a perspective of the settled communities, because they were at war with the nomads who were formidable warriors. Naturally, they expressed their sentiments against them. So, it has to be understood within that context. We should not accept that they were barbarians, but treat it as an example of historical evidence only. So, India was described as the central heaven, and China was described as the central heaven, and India was described as the western heaven. So, they tried to have access there, but ultimately it did not work. You see that the references to the West are now confused with the West in the modern sense, that is the Roman Empire or with Europe. It is very clear from the ancient Chinese sources that the West or the Western region only means Central Asia, adjoining regions, or sometimes, rarely, India. But it never ever means the Roman Empire or Greece or any of these countries of Europe. No. But when West is written with a capital W, people often think that West here means the West.
But where do you mean that these two notions are misunderstood?
In historical narrative.
Like it's modern Chinese historical narrative?
No, not modern Chinese. This narrative of the Silk Road. When people write its history, no, suppose they see that West is mentioned or Western regions is mentioned in the Chinese sources, they pick it up and they think that here the Chinese are talking about their trade links with Europe, with the Roman Empire. Whereas, as I said, that the West or the Western regions mean only Central Asia or at best India, but never the Roman Empire or Europe. So this is how misunderstanding starts there. Now I will try to speed up a bit because this is a very long topic and it's impossible to share everything with you here because of paucity of time. Let us look at a few more things. As I have said that it is the Central Asian nomads who actually created this trade network, neither India nor China nor any other sedentary civilization. And I have also argued that this network came into existence long before the great sedentary empires came into existence in China, in India or the Roman Empire. The trade network had been created long before that. Now there is another very important fact now to consider. I told you that Shankian traveled to Central Asia and he met the Yuchis there, and the Yuchis refused to have an alliance against the Yongno. These same Yuchis, more than 100, you are not able to, okay, okay. If I write it, would you be able to understand better? Okay, you can, okay. I have spoken about this in China, but that was a different kind of group, so I don't know exactly what, how much of my speech you can follow because of this difference in pronunciation. So late 2nd century BC, Shankian travels there and meets the Yuchis. More than a century later, one of the tribes of the Yuchis, they create what is called the Kushan Empire. Have you heard of the Kushan Empire? Kushan. Kushan. Yes, Kushan. It was one of the 5 Yuchi tribes.
Yeah.
Is it related to the Kushan dynasty?
Yes, 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 which was based in Central Asia, then moved to India. Kushan.
In Afghanistan?
Yes, yes, yes. In Afghanistan, what is now Pakistan. Kushans were originally one of the 5 tribes. They were one of the 5 tribes of the Yuchis. They created this empire from Central Asia, and they moved from Central Asia, they moved downward to India like this. From somewhere here, they moved like this, gradually until they reached somewhere here, over here, this, somewhere here. This was their movement. And as I have said, they were a nomadic people, one of the tribes of the Yuchis. Now, in the history of India, in the history of trade and commerce in India, it is widely believed by historians that the greatest commercial relations in the ancient period that India had with other powers such as China, Central Asia, Roman Empire was during the Kushan period. Why would that happen? Why would the relations be, the trade relations be so much stronger during the Kushan period? Can anybody make any guess about this?
They have once been a tribe of rich, and they have done the business with Chinese businessmen and government, and they know their lifestyles and their way behavior, so it's much more easier for them to communicate.
This would be one reason, but there is a very important reason, another reason. Think about, look at their geography. They moved from Central Asia. My principal argument is that the Central Asian nomads were the people who built this network. They had a big geographical advantage because all the routes, all the roads passed through Central Asia. So, if you control Central Asia, you are the master of that trade now. So, from Central Asia, the Kushans moved downward into India. They created an empire. So, they had access to all the routes. Without their support, no trade could be carried on between Central Asia and the sedentary civilizations and between the sedentary civilizations themselves. Virtually everything had to pass from this. So, a lot of archaeological evidence in India has been found which supports great commercial relations of India with other parts of the world during the period. I do not want to go into it, there are many things there. You have archaeological excavation at Gandhar where Roman coins of 2nd century have been found. There is another archaeological site in Jalalabad, it is called Ahindri Post Tope. There also Roman coins of the 2nd century have been found. Then there is a third site which is called the Begram Hoard. Begram Hoard. In that hoard a lot of luxury goods from China, Central Asia and from the Roman Empire have been found. I am telling you about this just to drive home the point that a lot of historical evidence of great commercial relations of India with other parts of the world including China and Central Asia has been found from this period. And the reason, as I said, one very important reason was their geographical location. And in fact, they probably, and this is backed by a very important literary source called Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Periplus of the Erythraean Sea was written in 70 AD. 70 AD, 1st century AD it was written. It gives a lot of evidence about the Roman trade with India, but it does not talk about Roman trade with China at all. Look at this, because the historical evidence of any direct trade links between the Roman Empire and China is almost completely lacking. But on the other hand, because of the geographical location of India, there was a lot of trade that was carried out between India and the Roman Empire. So, you find a lot of evidence of that kind. My contention is that whatever trade was carried out between China and the Roman Empire, whatever trade might have been carried out, it was predominantly through India, it was routed through India. It came up to Central Asia, from Central Asia it came downward to India, and from India then it went to Persian Gulf and onward to the Roman Empire, not through the Silk Road which is being depicted here. As I have said that no such Silk Road existed, and you do not find much evidence of trade being carried out along that road. Now, one very important point here is that on the basis of very small pieces of evidence, sometimes an entire historical narrative is created. That is what has happened in this case. So, did the ancient Chinese know about the geographical location of the Roman Empire, for example? There is very little evidence. Now, what is believed by some scholars is that the ancient Chinese referred to the Seleucid Empire as Li Khan and Roman Empire as Tachin. Tachin. So, it is commonly believed that Tachin refers to the Roman Empire. It is commonly believed, na? But the fact of the matter is, what were the relations? Is there any evidence of direct relations between China and the Roman Empire? There is none that you can find in history.
No, there is.
What is it?
In Han Dynasty, we found that there is a kind of,
Emissary who was sent, no?
let me search for the English name.
General Pan Chao sent an emissary called Qin Yang. He sent Qin Yang in 97 AD. In AD 97, the Chinese general who was based in Central Asia, General Pan Chao, I think he is called as Ban Chao, in Chinese, isn't it? Ban Chao. Huh. He sent an envoy, his name was Qin Yang, to explore this Tachin. Okay, but did he reach there? No, not at all. What happened was, this Qin Yang came up to here. He travelled from here up to here, and from here he came to the Persian Gulf. He reached up to Mesopotamia only.
So he just lose his way.
Pardon?
He lost his way.
No, he didn't lose his way. What happened was that between Central Asia and the Roman Empire was the Parthian Empire, the great Parthian Empire. Parthian Empire was also one of the great powers of the ancient world. They controlled the commercial routes from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, and they didn't want any direct trade links between Central Asia and the Roman Empire. This man Qin Yang naturally had to move through their territory. When he moved there, they met him and they told him that, they brought him to the Persian Gulf and they told him that further journey is very, very dangerous. Okay, you would not be able to survive it, and therefore it is better you go back from here. So he had to come back from the Persian Gulf only. He never went beyond Mesopotamia. So he was sent, but he couldn't reach. Okay. There is another evidence then. In AD 166, 167, AD 166, 167, and this is from the Chinese records, there was supposedly an envoy sent by the Roman Empire, by this Tachin, to the Chinese court. Now, this envoy claimed to be a representative of Anton, the Emperor Anton. Anton probably refers either Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, who belonged to that period, or the second Roman emperor, who is called Antoninus Pius. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus or Antoninus Pius, probably Anton refers to one of these. But the surprising thing is that this man, the gifts that he gave to the Chinese court, what were they? They were ivory and rhinoceros horn, both of which were produced in Southeast Asia. So many historians believe that this man was a fraud. He was claiming to be from Rome in order to get trade concessions from the Chinese court.
But how about the Africa? They also have the ivory things.
Yes.
Yeah, can he come from the Africa and go through the the Red Sea and the
Yes, but it is only deep Africa, not the Mediterranean Africa that had these things. No,
yes.
Roman Empire did not have access to those regions.
Yeah, I see.
That's the thing, no. So it's like if you go somewhere as a representative of an emperor, you would always carry some credentials, some gifts, some letters, etc., etc. It's not that you would go and say that I am a representative of the Roman emperor or of the Chinese emperor. Anyway, the point is that apart from this, there is no other evidence. Now see, did the Romans know about the Chinese geography or about even Central Asian geography? No, not at all. We all know about Pliny. Pliny has written that great book Natural History, which runs into volumes. One entire volume is dedicated to the geography of Asia, but there is no mention of Central Asian geography there. And Pliny's Natural History is written in 1st century AD. Then come to Ptolemy's geography. Ptolemy's geography, again a voluminous work, is written in the 2nd century AD. It has very little understanding of the geography of even Central Asia, leave aside that of China. They didn't even know where China was. They could only guess, that's it, nothing beyond it. This was their problem. They didn't even know the geography. So if they didn't even know the geography, how could there be a direct trade route running all the way from China or Mongolia to the Roman Empire? This is the point I have been making. I earlier told you about that work Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which gives evidence of trade. Very interestingly, Periplus uses the word Thina, Thina. See, Thina. Thina is supposed to mean China. Okay. Now the author of the Periplus says that this Thina produces a lot of silk and a lot of other things. So it is supposed to mean China, but you know what it says, that it is a city, not a country. Periplus says that it is a city, a great city, and it is located somewhere in Central Asia. They do not know about the geography of China at all, or where it is and how to reach there. In fact, Ptolemy's geography says that there was this stone tower somewhere in Bactria. They say that the land of the Ceres is supposed to mean China. They say that that land does not even start here. In fact, it is very far away from here, and they say that it requires further journey of 7 months. From Central Asia, you have to travel for 7 months at a stretch in order to reach the Chinese capital. Nobody had gone there. There is no evidence, historical evidence of anybody having traveled all the way from there. So this is the state of affairs. Let us look at the archaeological evidence. Is there any archaeological evidence that Chinese silk in large quantities was being exported to the Roman Empire? Very little. I will tell you. As I said, that first of all, the ancient Chinese were not very happy in giving away silk. They gave silk only either in exchange for horses which were precious, or as gifts sometimes, etc., as a precious gift on diplomatic missions, etc. But it was not a common commodity of trade. Silk was not a common commodity of trade for China. Now, on top of it, you find that silk had captured, because Chinese silk was the best silk, though silk was produced by some other countries also, but the Chinese silk was of a very superior quality. So silk had captured the imagination of people. It was an important luxury good, and therefore what has happened is that the silk that was produced elsewhere, not in China, okay, that is now attributed to China. People think that it is Chinese silk. Now, how do we understand whether or not it is Chinese silk? Does anybody know that? You have to do scientific investigation to understand the chemical composition of silk. The chemical composition of the Chinese silk would be different from that of Indian silk or Iranian silk or any other silk. That is how you ascertain whether or not it is Chinese silk. Merely by looking at it, you can't tell whether it is Chinese silk or not. So one scholar has done this analysis, and he found that out of 1000 samples that were found in Europe of silk that was described as Chinese, only one was actually found to be Chinese. The rest were all produced in Europe, in Byzantine Empire. Some were produced in Iran. Iran in fact used to produce a lot of silk, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, and India used to produce a wide variety of silk, which again, in fact in India, Chinese silk was described in one way and Indian silk was described in another. So there was one word for Indian silk and another word for Chinese silk. So it was clearly recognized that we also produce silk, but the Chinese silk is of superior quality. There was another word for it, but India also produced a lot of silk. So you see that as far as archaeological evidence is concerned, there is very little that substantiates the claim of this road. Have any Roman coins been found from China, from anywhere? Not to the best of my knowledge. The earliest Roman coins, because if you carry on trade, you will find some coins, isn't it, and other things. The earliest Roman coins that have been found from China belong to the late 6th century, after the Roman Empire has fallen. Roman Empire has fallen, the Byzantine Empire has come into existence. The earliest Roman coins that have been found from China belong to the Byzantine period, not the Roman Empire period. So if the trade was so large, what is the archaeological evidence? So quite clearly, on the basis of very little evidence, history evidence here and there, ignoring the role of Central Asian nomads in building this entire trade network, a set of historians and other scholars have created this entire narrative that the Silk Road came into existence in the 2nd century BC. It has always been there. I can carry on, but I want to leave time now. There are many other points to be made. One last point, that the Silk Road did not what you describe as the Silk Road did not come to an end in the 15th or 16th century when the Europeans were able to find a direct sea route. In fact, it continued right up to the 18th century because trade had always required both kinds of network, land based network and sea based network. There is no opposition between the two, they have always coexisted just like they coexist now. So, I open it now to questions and comments.
So, why did the Silk Road, why was the Silk Road narrated to die away because of the like the ocean one? Because you mentioned that they narrated the Silk Road as to start from the Han Dynasty because of the Western ideology or something. But then why did they narrate the dying process of the Silk Road as like
Dying process.
Yes, I mean the dying process, because you mentioned it was actually during 18th century, but then why did they?
Yes, that's a very, very good question. Now see, I said at the beginning of my lecture that the West created this idea that the Silk Road had existed in the 19th century because they were the dominant power around the world. They were trying to open up China, they were trying to open up other countries, they wanted to redefine their past, they wanted to re-understand their past, they wanted to project themselves as the dominant civilization in the history of the world. So, they were trying to build their linkages, understand their linkages with other civilizations. That is how they created this narrative. Now, when they give this argument that after Europe discovered the sea route to India and China, the road died out, what does it mean? It means that the road had always existed for them, for their sake now. The road had existed according to this idea for trade between India, China and these countries with Europe. And when Europe found a direct sea route, why would the road exist then? There is no need for it. As against this, I am arguing that the land based trade network had always coexisted with the maritime network, with sea network. Depending upon various considerations, depending upon the kind of goods you were carrying, depending upon the distances involved, the cost involved, the political climate, etc., etc., you decided, the traders decided, not some king or emperor, traders decided whether to carry goods by land or by sea, or to mix the two. As I said, that so often goods were carried from Mongolia or China up to Central Asia, and from Central Asia they did not go straight, they came to India, and from India then, from Western India, the goods were carried by the sea to the West. So, the two had coexisted, but when the West created this narrative in the 19th century, you see that the road came into existence because Han Emperor wanted to trade with the West. This is the narrative, and it came to an end because Europe had found another route. So, when you found another route, what is the need for this? So, in both these, it is the Western agency that is dominant, isn't it? It is the West because of which the road came into existence, and it is because of the West that it died out. This is how history becomes distorted. I have already said that the road network had existed for thousands of years, and nomads had played the dominant role in it. Sedentary civilizations had participated in it, but the dominant role was that of the nomads. But the Western narrative, presents a very different picture. Yes.
So what's the role of India in the Silk Road? Because you just mentioned that the Kushan Empire, they once moved southward into India, today's Pakistan area, and they play an important role in connecting the Central Asia, China, and Roman Empire. So I want to know what happens after the collapse of Kushan Empire.
I will tell you. As I said, that the peak of international trade of India and of other countries was reached during the Kushan period. After that, most historians believe that international trade started declining. It did not come to an end suddenly, but over the centuries, Kushan Empire came to an end in the 2nd century towards the second century, towards the end of the 2nd century AD. After that, India's trade with Central Asia, with China and the Roman Empire started to decline gradually, because that geographical and strategic advantage that the Kushan Empire had was no longer there, but it continued for several centuries. Similarly, you find that probably China's trade with India also declined, though on this count the historical evidence is not so complete, but there is evidence to show that after the demise of the Kushan Empire, India's trade with China also declined. But by the way, India's trade with China to some extent continued, and predominantly from India it is cotton that was exported to China, and from China it is silk that was taken. Cotton.
Oh yeah, cotton. Yeah.
Yes, cotton, because India is specialized more in cotton and China is specialized more in silk. So trade never came to a complete end, but when political conditions changed, when economic conditions changed, then obviously trade declined, as it happens even now. After the Great Recession of 2008, China's trade with the rest of the world has declined. I am sure you know this data, isn't it? China's international trade had been growing very, very fast for 30 years, but after 2008, it has either declined or it has started growing at a much slower pace. And this has happened with many other countries also. So you are not the master of your own destiny in history. There are so many other things, other factors, geography, political conditions, change of empires, change of dynasties, etc., that affect the course of history. And this is especially important in political and economic history. So you see, when conditions were favorable, there was a lot of trade between two countries. When they were not so favorable, trade came down, but generally it did not die out completely.
Yeah, so you say that the name of the Silk Road is constructed by the Germany modern geographics.
Yes.
And China will use this kind of Silk Road to build up our relatively good impression on others.
Pardon? I don't.
And China will use this kind of the Silk Road, this kind of impression, a good impression.
Today in China?
Yeah. So, what's your opinion toward today's One Belt One Road? Do you think
No. See, I am not an expert on international relations, so this is.
I just want to simply ask you, what's your personal impression of this kind of project?
I have been to China, as I said, and I have spoken on this subject also. Of course, people are taking a lot of interest in this. And as a policy matter that China is handling today, it is a totally different thing, as I said, because China is now building infrastructure. You see, this is how history is employed. As I said earlier, you see, the West created this narrative for their own purposes. So now, of course, China may also find this useful, that there was something like this, and we can build it along. But that's that. History is like this, You can pick and choose out of history, whatever suits you. So if tomorrow it suits India also, India might also say that yes, we were the dominant player. If there was this Silk Road, we were the dominant players, and therefore we are going to build another Silk Road of that kind. This is how nations and countries behave. They pick out.
We know that India also have the similar program like One Belt One Road, cooperating with Africa, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Something. This is what I am saying now. Yeah. That countries pick and choose out of history what suits their national interest. I am no expert of IR, therefore I don't want to go deeper into this. I want to focus only on history. But since you have asked me, I can speculate and say this, that nations make use of history on the basis of their self-interest. But as I have said, China did not invent this idea. The idea was invented by the West. China carried on trade, but China never described this trade network as Silk Road or Silk Roads. In fact, China was generally unwilling to trade in silk, as I have said. Yeah. It gave silk very rarely, in exchange either for precious goods or in exchange for for diplomatic and such other reasons, as gifts, precious gifts, etc. So silk was never the dominant commodity of trade along this route. Let me assert, silk was never the dominant commodity of trade. It is other things gems, jewelry, glassware, other textiles, horses, hides, livestock, furs, etc. These were probably as important or maybe even more important sometimes items of trade as compared to silk. But silk is a luxury item, it is a glamorous thing, so it captures the imagination of people. In the West it captured the imagination of people, so they started describing China as the land of silk. So they created this stereotype that in China you have silk everywhere, so they wanted silk from China.
Maybe
Yeah.
this kind of imagination is overacting. I mean, it can be regarded as a factor to explain the invasion of China.
Exactly, this is what, no, because they created a romanticized image. This is my point. They created a romanticized image of China, they also created a romanticized image of India. They created a romanticized image of all the Asian countries in fact. Why is it that Christopher Columbus started out from Europe looking for India? Why? What is the reason? Today nobody starts from there looking out for India. The reason is very simple, because India and China were regarded as the lands of prosperity and abundance and of opportunity. So Europe was relatively poor then, they did not have too many things to trade with others, and therefore when they wanted to develop, when they wanted to grow, when they wanted to carry on trade, they wanted to come either to India or to China. These were the two main countries, the largest and the biggest and the most prosperous countries of the world at that time, and therefore all European powers, they wanted to come to India and China. So Columbus reached America, that is a different matter, but he wanted to come to India. Vasco da Gama, he came there, and in fact many of these European travelers, they were trying to find a way across the Pacific to Cathay. Cathay was, it probably referred to Japan and parts of China. Are you familiar with this word Cathay? C-A-T-H-A-Y. C-A-T-H-A-Y. Anyway, the point is that these lands were regarded as the lands of prosperity and abundance, and therefore the Europeans were looking for them. They had created a glamorized image of them, that they have a lot of gold, they have a lot of silver, they have silk, they have ivory, and they have such other products. This was the dominant narrative that they had created, and to some extent it continued for a very long time.
But we can't rewrite the history.
Pardon?
We can't rewrite the history and change the narrative. We just move forward.
Yes. Yes, as I
We
said.
make them feel guilty, but we cannot change the things which already happened.
No, but understanding of history can always be changed, and it should be changed actually, you see. History is never one, there is no given history. Let me say this, that this is a non-historical notion. To think that there is one given history is not correct. There is a relationship between facts of history and your understanding of history, but that relationship is a dynamic relationship. With the same facts, you can also draw another narrative of history. Okay? So on the basis of only a few facts, they built up this entire narrative of the Silk Road. But today you can question it also, tomorrow you can do something else as well, depending upon your own choices. But what is important in history is that there should be a professional attitude towards it. You should try to keep yourself free from biases and prejudices as much as possible. Try to take all the available facts and evidence into account before you write history. But quite often that does not happen, and that is why history is written and rewritten again. It keeps happening. It is a part of history writing actually. There is no one history. We all are taught as students in our schools and also at the undergraduate level that history is some given history, but that is not true. History has been rewritten again and again. As I said, when West became dominant in the 19th century, they wanted to rewrite the history of the world according to their own understanding of their role in the history of the world, and that is why this is just one example. The Silk Road narrative is just one example. There are dozens of such things that they created, for example, and those things have come down to us. We have accepted them blindly. Let us look at the term Asia. Where does this come from? Did anybody in
Greece.
Did anybody in China or India earlier in ancient period use the term Asia? Never. It is a Western coinage.
They're from Greece. It means the birthplace of the sun. Yeah.
India itself is a Western, the name India itself is a Western coinage. It is not of Indian origin.
Yeah.
India never described itself as India. But
From
now,
the
but but now India has become common. This word has become common. So in a way you can say that history is always written and rewritten as a result of the dynamics of the present, the equations of the present.
But does it hurt
Huh?
if we just keep it alone? If we don't rewrite it, does it hurt?
Well, that depends upon which side you are, So let me give you an example. Let us take the history of slavery, for example. Slavery existed in the history of humanity for a very long time, and people accepted it as a matter of fact thing, isn't it? Slavery continued right up to the 19th century. Slaves were, people were captured from Africa and they were taken to the Americas, and this continued to happen till the 19th century. But if you are a victim of something, some historical force, can you accept it calmly then? Probably you cannot. But if you are a beneficiary of it, like the West is, it is easy for you to say that, well, others also did wrong things, so what wrong did we commit? No. Now you look at one very interesting fact is, now the West is teaching human rights to everyone, isn't it? Now the West is teaching human rights to everyone. I remember now they have stopped talking about this to China. Ever since China became quite powerful in the last 10-15 years, they have stopped doing that. But till the period of Bill Clinton, every year there used to be some kind of a preaching, some kind of a speech in which Bill Clinton and or other presidents would say that to China, well, your human rights record is not good, etc., etc., you must improve it. It is only because, not that China's human rights record has improved, I don't want to comment on that. The point is that China has become too powerful now for America to make that comment, and therefore it doesn't make the comment. Not that the facts have changed on the ground, the facts remain virtually the same, but you don't want to ruffle the feathers now, okay, you accept it as it is. This is how history keeps changing, perceptions of things keep changing as power equations change. This we must understand. So history is a dynamic discipline. History has to be written, it has to be rewritten. If you are a beneficiary of something, you try to often defend it, but you should not. You should try to understand the position of the victims of history also, okay. And in many ways, non-Western powers have been victims of history, Africans have been victims of history. When we talk about slavery, many other peoples of the world have also been victims of history. All that should be acknowledged rather than pushed under the carpet. And this I am saying not only for the West but for others also. In history, all opinions, all evidence, positions of all peoples, all groups must be acknowledged and taken into account before a balanced history can be written. If you take only one side into account, you can never write balanced history. That is what professional history should be all about, not a one-sided history. And that is why I focused on this subject. I thought that I would want to give you a glimpse of how history comes into existence, how it is defined and redefined by people for their own purposes, for their own benefit, for their own interests.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for doing so.
Thank you very much.